All right, hi, Read 516. This should be our last screencast. So we were just talking about the idea of, what were we talking about? The idea of the informal assessments, right? So the bottom line is that these informal classroom-based assessments are kind of these assessments that we take on the run, and they're helpful for planning and for helping to adapt our daily instruction, but they're not as appropriate when you need specific information or you want to take a more in-depth look. So when you want to do that, we can start to look at some of our structured assessments. So you spent chapter 8 thinking about the difference um, or thinking about what structured assessments are. So with structured assessments, there's still informal assessments, but rather than these classroom-based assessments that the teacher is just kind of giving on the run, these have uh, directions with them usually, right? So they're usually published. Um, they're produced commercially. They have instructions or directions, but they're still informal, right? But what they do, or what you want to make sure is, you're not confusing them with the formal tests that are designed to compare a student's score to that of other students, but rather they're designed to evaluate a student's performance against a set of criteria for acceptability or acceptable performance. So let's think about some of the assessments we're going to be using this semester. So the QRI, right? QRI, which is the Qualitative Reading Inventory, is a structured assessment. It's a structured assessment. It is published, right? It is commercial. It has directions that you are supposed to follow when you give it. Um, and it is supposed to give you a measure of, let's say, how well that student is reading on second grade level, right? It's a very, goes over all the different parts of reading, but it gives you an idea of how a student performs relative to the criteria for what a second grade reader should be able to do. The core inside of it has many structured assessments. So one of the things to keep in mind about the structured assessments is that, and I said it 3 times now, they usually have directions and a routine instructions for giving them, right? This is important because it gives you that um, measure of reliability, right? As you use them with every student, you're doing it the same way. These are often good structured assessments, are assessments that mimic classroom reading instruction. So they're more generalizable than formal assessments. So the tasks, which are usually more authentic, would be more like what a student is likely to do in class related to reading. So they're likely to read a passage, maybe read it out loud or read it to themselves, and answer a variety of questions related to that. And those could be questions that they discuss with the teacher. As we get to the QRL, you'll see that there's an oral section and then ones that they answer on their own, right? And they, again, they contain specific procedures, directions, materials to ensure consistent assessment practices. So every student reads that you give that assessment to would be reading that same passage for that grade level. We're reading that same list of words to help you choose which passage to give them. So some examples, like I just said, so informal reading inventories, the QRI is one of them. The Stieglitz Informal Reading Inventory, or the SIRI, is another comprehensive reading inventory, or the classroom reading inventory. So you may be familiar with none, all, or some of those. Uh, Structured assessments for study skills. So we also have some of those, and those would be examples like the SMART, um, Science, Social Studies, and Math Academic Reading Test, Approaches and Study Skills Reading Inventory. So these for our older students. There are reading miscue inventories. Uh, excuse me. The NAEP oral reading fluency scale. There's word lists. We're going to use these like Fry's word list. Or spelling inventories like Words Their Way, which is something we're going to get into in just a couple weeks. So all of these are examples of structured assessments, and these are essentially what you're going to be using this semester to do a lot of your work. So you had an article to read on anecdotal records. Um, So anecdotal records are a type of informal assessments. They're classroom-based, they could be curriculum-based, and they're considered an authentic assessment. And my very good friend and colleague, Dr. Boyd Batstone, would tell us, or does tell us, that authentic assessment is defined by the active role that the teacher plays in classroom-based assessment of actual literary experiences, right? So it's that part of that interaction between the teacher and student. So when you're thinking about using anecdotal records, there's a few steps you should follow, right? So of course, select the students that you want to observe ahead of time, and you'll notice that some of these help you avoid some of the limitations or the pitfalls of using informal assessment. You want to establish a content standard that you're going to focus on. So you're not covering all of them. You're focused on one in particular. You want to write quality anecdotal records, right? We'll talk in a minute about what that means. You want a system for managing and organizing those records. You want to have the time to analyze those records, right? So let's talk about quality. So quality, use observable data, right? Anecdotal records. These are essentially you recording that interaction between you and the student and the interaction between the student and the assessment, right? It's an anecdote. So you have to be able to use or record what you can observe, right? So what is the student specifically doing? Writing something like the student is on task isn't a quality anecdotal record, a quality piece of information. You want to define for yourself at least what on task is. So, oh, the student read 3 pages and is answering 3 questions, right? Use quantitative measures as much as possible, right? What can you count? So the student looked up 4 times. The student reread the word twice. You're recording this information for yourself so that you don't rely just on your memory. You can go back and you can analyze this, and it's useful. Use be aware of words like know or understand. They're not really observable. So when you say the student seems to understand or the student understood, what does that mean? Use abbreviations. Write in the past tense. It's helpful, right? It's a recording. Provide examples. So if you can't maybe think of a way, you can do this 2 ways. So if you can't think of a way to express understand, write yourself a little example of what the student was doing or what the student said that made you think they understood. Also, if there's words they're repeating and you're counting how many times they repeat, maybe write down examples of those actual words. You may recognize a pattern later on. Don't use the C word. Avoid redundancy. So just some kind of tips for quality anecdotal records, and obviously we've gone into much more detail in the reading. So the benefit of using them serves as a formative assessment to measure the strengths and needs. Remember, formative, are they learning? Can help you to plan instruction. They're data, right? They give you good data. You can also could also be used as summative assessments to share with families. So when you're having those conferences with the parents, you can use that data or that collection of anecdotal records and formative assessments. They can be used as, formative and summative, and you can share them with other staff members, particularly if you have, if you're in the role of reading specialist and you're sharing with the classroom teacher. And the entire process can be based on the classroom experience, performance, and content standards. So they're a really flexible way of gathering data on your students. So I know in your syllabus it said that we were going to touch on the RTI piece. I'm actually going to save that. You didn't really have any reading to do related to it, but really it's talking about how all of these assessment pieces fall into implementing a response to intervention model. But I think for some of you, this may be a lot to digest what we just went over this week. And we're not going to touch on RTI again for a couple of weeks, and so I'll have to go over it all again. So for now, that is it for week 2. I put this little quote up here to leave you with for the week. So for teacher education to be effective, it must change both teacher and student behavior. So in thinking about your theory of assessment and hopefully growing and improving and adding to your assessment philosophy, think about how this quote could or should relate to that. And have a great week.